If you're the kind of person who's constantly keeping up with video game news, then you'll know that the name Jason Schreier is pretty synonymous in that territory. There is no denying that he's one of few bona fide journalists in games right now, having sought out and broken a wide array of exclusive, well-researched stories. He's the reason we know so much about the troubled development histories of games like Mass Effect Andromeda and Destiny, about the circumstances surrounding Visceral Games' shutdown, and he's also proven to be a reliable source for leaks, particularly where Bethesda is concerned, having leaked an early script of Fallout 4 years before the game came out, and having leaked that Fallout 76 would be an online survival RPG well before Bethesda confirmed it down the line, and these are just a few of his work. This is a man who I genuinely respect for his work, and it is my belief that he's played a pivotal role in furthering the general public's understanding of some of the less fortunate aspects of the gaming industry. Now, just because I respect someone doesn't necessarily mean that I'll agree with everything they have to say, which brings me to a recent string of tweets that Jason posted in response to some of the backlash that the recently released Assassin's Creed Odyssey has garnered in regards to its microtransaction scheme. Not only did Jason defend the existence of XP boosters in the game, he also went as far as condemning YouTubers who criticize these kinds of business practices that game publishers tend to gravitate towards these days. Here's what Jason had to say. Here's my take. I've spent 25 hours with Assassin's Creed Odyssey so far, and 1, it's phenomenal. 2, I've never once noticed or thought about the XP booster or microtransactions. That probably wouldn't make for much of a YouTube video though. It's sad how YouTube facilitates this culture where people toss around words like exploitative and predatory without really thinking about what they mean. Assassin's Creed Odyssey's microtransactions are at worst annoying. They're not a cancer on the video game industry. Now, what prompted Jason to suddenly lash out like this is up for debate, but based on the timing, I personally gather that it might have to do with videos like the one Jim Sterling released a few days ago in which he expressed how greedy he believes Assassin's Creed Odyssey's monetization scheme to be, particularly focusing on the game's grindy nature that may encourage the purchase of time savers like XP and currency boosters, especially with the latter stages of the main campaign being level-gated. The way he put it was that Assassin's Creed Odyssey and games like it purposely create a problem so they can sell you the solution. Jim also responded to a tweet posted by one of the game's voice actors, Elias Tufexis, who plays Leonidas in Odyssey and who you may also know as the voice of Adam Jensen in the Deus Ex series. Elias's tweet has since been deleted, but I saw it before it was taken down, and he basically asked the Twitter user why he's so upset about the game's microtransactions when the feature is optional. Jim retweeted Elias's inquiry and bluntly responded with, quote, "Grind isn't optional. The player choice excuse has been debunked time and again. I'm done hearing it. I didn't choose ads for premium credits in my loading screens. I didn't choose the fun skins and weapons being paywalled. I didn't choose a slow leveling system. I didn't choose an exclusive weapon being in Walmart pizza rolls. Microtransactions are the publisher's choice, not the player's choice." Now, I cannot say with certainty that Jim Sterling's video and tweets directly caused a response from Jason Schreier, but the Kotaku editor is clearly referencing YouTubers like Jim Sterling, among many others, who have been vocal about their disdain towards Assassin's Creed Odyssey's microtransactions and similar monetization schemes. I would also have to assume that I may be among those YouTubers he's generalizing and lambasting. Though I have yet to talk about Assassin's Creed Odyssey specifically, I have been a vocal critic about microtransactions in general, so I feel the need to respond to what feels like direct condemnation on Jason's part. To do that, let's first discuss Assassin's Creed Odyssey's microtransactions, about which I heard a wide range of feedback. Now, few will deny that the game itself is actually pretty damn good, if a bit formulaic at times. The world is beautiful to behold, the gameplay mechanics have been refined from Origins, and there's an overwhelming amount of content that people can get lost in. The general consensus also seems to be that microtransactions in Assassin's Creed Odyssey are far from absolutely necessary to enjoy the game from start to finish. But the topic of how the game level gates the main story's progression in conjunction with paid XP boosters is one that's proved to be divisive among the gaming community. One side argues that in their experience, the game flowed and progressed well enough for them that there was never a point in which purchasing the game's XP boosters ever crossed their mind. These people tend to be those who partake in lots of side quests while progressing through the main campaign. The other side argues that in their experience, the game overall felt like it was made to be artificially grindy in order to encourage the purchase of XP boosters, especially with parts of the main campaign being level gated. This crowd I found tends to be comprised of those who like to focus on the main campaign while doing the occasional side quest along the way. From the looks of it, whether you feel as though Assassin's Creed Odyssey's microtransactions have a tangible intrusive effect on gameplay experience bogs down to playstyle. Those who do a bunch of side quests are far less likely to find a problem with it, while those who prefer to beeline through the main campaign are more likely to be bothered by it. My take on this situation is that neither side is entirely wrong, but what I will say is that the notion that Assassin's Creed Odyssey offers player choice or player option is kind of bullshit. Again, not everyone will be affected or at all bothered by the game's progression structure, and that's a perfectly valid point, but there is a crowd who actually found the flow and pacing of the game to be more enjoyable after they applied the XP boost. Perhaps this crowd is more in the minority, but it does exist, and for those people, what I'm wondering is, where is their choice? If it were up to the player to decide how they want to tailor the game's progression to their liking, then something like XP boosts wouldn't be paywalled for an additional $10. It would just be something that one would be able to toggle to their heart's content. These paywalled XP boosts don't kill the game, not by a long shot. The game's still enjoyable, but it does segregate a portion of the player base who find the boosted experience gains to be preferable to the default setting, and those people don't have a choice but to shell out extra cash on top of the premium price they paid for whatever edition they bought. In that regard, I couldn't agree more with the notion that this is indeed not the player's choice, it's the publisher's choice, though it's hardly the worst microtransaction scheme we have seen. So that's generally where I stand on that front, which brings me back to Jason's recent tweets, through which he expressed that he found the game to be phenomenal and that he never once noticed or thought about the XP booster or microtransactions. I don't have a particular problem with people having that opinion. I know plenty of people who feel the same way, and it's a valid sentiment to have. What I do have a problem with, however, is him expressing the notion that those on the other side of the argument, particularly YouTubers who have expressed their personal distaste for how microtransactions intruded their gameplay experience, are simply making their argument to make an attractive video rather than to share their perspective. He basically insinuated that YouTubers are being purposely dishonest for the sake of views. It's just a level of slander that I find to be as unwarranted as it is kind of narrow-minded. On top of that, he insinuates YouTubers don't know what they're talking about when they use words like exploitative and predatory, that they don't think about what those words actually mean. Again, I have nothing against those who had a great time with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, or against those who argue that they never once felt the need to purchase XP boosters to enjoy the game. But I also don't believe that terms like predatory or exploitative are being misused by certain crowds that did feel as though paywalled XP boosters had a negative impact on their personal enjoyment of the game, or that did feel as though being able to toggle XP boosters as simply as one would choose a difficulty mode would have made their overall experience better. With Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Ubisoft essentially made what are normally fully optional side quests somewhat mandatory to an extent. So those who prefer to skip those or save them for another time, those who prefer to see the main campaign through completion first, are left with an experience that could feel overdrawn by requiring them to partake in side activities. Obviously, Jason Schreier isn't within that crowd. Obviously, he found microtransactions to be at worst annoying rather than outright detrimental, and that's his prerogative. But for others, seeing a feature as basic as toggled, accelerated progression being paywalled, when it could have easily just been implemented in the game as an optional feature, was enough to mar their experience, something that wouldn't have happened in a pre-microtransactions era. I honestly find it hard to argue that Assassin's Creed Odyssey's overall design wasn't on some level affected by time savers like XP boosters. It wasn't affected to the point where the game's enjoyment is irreparably marred, but enough that it did leave certain players feeling like they unnecessarily got the shorter end of the stick. To them, these microtransactions are a little more than just annoying, and I don't think it's fair to completely invalidate these folks feeling like they are being preyed upon to some extent. Even Jason Schreier unwittingly acknowledged that Odyssey's microtransactions will only be inconsequential to a certain crowd. Responding to a Twitter user dissenting against Jason's comments, Jason responded with, quote, "It's really hard to imagine anyone playing the game for 25 hours, taking their time to explore and do side quests, and still feeling this way." Well, yeah, it's hard to imagine for those who take the time to explore and do side quests, but not everyone is the kind of player who partake in looking into every nook and cranny of a giant open world, and they certainly shouldn't feel like they're being forced to do so. Some genuinely find this aspect exhausting and prefer to get right down to brass tacks, or partake in optional missions in moderation, a perfectly valid sentiment. They aren't lesser players for it, they're just different from those who do like to spend dozens of hours doing side activities before finally progressing in the main storyline, and in Odyssey, these types of players have less of a choice. So to counter Jason's point, I would say it's easy to imagine anyone who'd prefer primarily tackling the campaign feeling like Odyssey is skewed against them, especially with the option to mitigate that being dangled right in front of them for a significant price on top of what they already paid for the base game. Now, Jason did acknowledge that there are certain forms of microtransactions that are predatory, citing loot boxes and mobile games in particular, as they are specifically tailored to appeal to gambling addicts. But as this Twitter user rightly responded, in my opinion, just because there are worse versions of something doesn't make that something good. While Jason is absolutely right in that Odyssey's XP boosters are nowhere near as egregious as, say, Battlefront 2 loot boxes, the fact that such a feature is paywalled in the first place does feel like a hindrance for those it does affect. Just because murder is a far worse crime than stealing a candy bar from a store doesn't mean we should just ignore people who steal candy, right? Jason argues that those who say Odyssey's microtransactions are predatory lack perspective, but I would argue Jason needs to take a look in the mirror. All he's basically said is that the game's in-game purchases haven't affected him personally, ergo, anyone who might have had a different experience are only doing so to draw attention, specifically calling out YouTubers. If you ask me, that is the very definition of lacking perspective and being narrow-minded. Jason then responded by acknowledging microtransactions do make one wonder if a game was designed around them, but insisted that once you play Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you realize that it's a great game and that microtransactions aren't predatory in this case. The response to that was that just because a game is fun or great doesn't necessarily mean people aren't being preyed upon, or that the game wasn't to some degree marred by the inclusion of microtransactions. I tend to agree with Nick here. A game like Counter-Strike Global Offensive brings great fun to millions of people, but that doesn't mean that its skin gambling economy isn't predatory. I mean, it's literally just gambling. Just because Assassin's Creed Odyssey is a great game that's fun to play doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be those who won't have their experience marred by the decision to paywall an accelerated rate of progression that might be more appealing to some people. Jason concluded this conversation by expressing his belief that there is a nuanced conversation to be had about the existence of microtransactions and whether they make games worse, before citing how YouTube culture and the constant shrieking of every microtransactions being predatory and exploitative has made that conversation hard to find. Now, I'm all for a nuanced conversation between consumers, content creators, journalists, and video game developers on the role that microtransactions play in the gaming industry. But the thing is, Jason, you are being woefully hypocritical by calling for a nuanced discussion while generalizing all YouTube content creators as this misguided bunch, while suggesting we make videos just for the sake of seeking views and attention. What's nuanced about just trashing all YouTubers like that and dismissing a crowd that genuinely found Odyssey's microtransactions to be distasteful based on their personal experience, even if that disagrees with your personal point of view? You're literally doing the very thing you're denouncing by presenting yourself like this. How can you call for a nuanced discussion when you yourself are clearly unwilling to have one, when you're unwilling to acknowledge the other side? And the thing is, it's also not as if all microtransactions are widely being denounced. For example, I generally find that certain free-to-play titles with generous in-game purchases featuring cosmetic items only that don't affect gameplay and that can be earned by playing, such as Fortnite, are a prime example of monetization handled right that few people have major complaints about. But microtransactions in a AAA single-player title? Yeah, I have not once seen a case where these types of games are positively affected by the inclusion of in-game purchases, or as publishers like to call it, player choice. Not once have I seen microtransactions give rather than take away, or an aspect of a game progress rather than regress, even in small, gradual ways. At best, they are tolerable, and at worst, they completely mar the integrity of a game's single-player design and progression. Where Assassin's Creed Odyssey resides in that spectrum, I think depends on the kind of player you are, on whether you're the type to tackle side quests aplenty or to get right down to finishing the campaign first and foremost. But I believe it's safe to say that XP boosters are certainly not a player choice. They are paywalled by design, and people like Jason may not have found them in any way predatory, which again is a valid opinion, but if he really wants a nuanced conversation, it's important for him to be open-minded about players who do feel affected by this scheme. Moving on, in another thread, Jason was asked why microtransactions should be in games at all if they supposedly aren't noticeable, expressing how he doesn't want to support the gradual creeping of marketplaces into games. Jason's response was that the alternative was games rising in cost to $70 or $80, while noting that game development budgets have gone up, arguing something's gotta give. First of all, prices of games have risen right under our noses, and Assassin's Creed Odyssey is Exhibit A with its dizzying array of editions, ranging from Standard, Gold, Deluxe Ultimate, Medusa, Spartan to Pantheon. Sure, the option of purchasing the standard $60 edition is still there, but you are bound to get a slightly less complete package, so people will be more inclined to purchase the pricier $80 deluxe edition, or if they're into collecting limited edition items, up to a whopping $220 special edition. Yes, the budget of games development has risen, of that there is no denying, but for a AAA company like Ubisoft, which is selling all of these different editions and already has plenty of other games raking in microtransactions revenue aplenty, I guarantee you that there was no tangible need for Assassin's Creed Odyssey to include in-game purchases on top of everything. Ubisoft isn't some startup company that's barely hanging by a thread, it's a multi-billion-dollar company that's got all kinds of revenue streams, and Assassin's Creed Odyssey would have most certainly made its money back and then some even without recurrent monetization, without having to paywall XP boosters that some find preferable to the default progression rate. Ubisoft is one among many companies that do not need our sympathy as far as financial concerns go. This notion that properly marketed, properly budgeted, and properly developed AAA games, particularly single-player ones, must include microtransactions for major game companies to thrive is one of the greatest lies that the gaming industry managed to sell, and I didn't expect Jason of all people to provide this paltry justification. I mean, you've got single-player games like God of War, Spider-Man, Zelda Breath of the Wild, and the Witcher series, just to name a few, which have sold millions and seen great financial success without having to resort to in-game purchases. So what is Ubisoft's excuse with Assassin's Creed Odyssey besides a tinge of avarice? Now, when it was pointed out to Jason that Odyssey is already being sold at a higher price point through the game's various editions, Jason responded with, "Yup, but I find it hard to get mad at Ubisoft for all that ridiculousness when they made an enormous, incredible RPG that's on par with The Witcher 3 in scope and quality. This ain't NBA 2K19. Okay, so in your experience, Jason, it's hard to get mad at Ubisoft for the ridiculousness. You didn't feel affected by paywalled XP boosters, and that's great, but that isn't a proper justification for their inclusion. The previous argument was that it's about budget, but as soon as somebody pointed out all the ways Odyssey can make its money back without microtransactions, that argument was immediately dropped in favor of, well, it's hard to get mad at them. That's just you pointing out your tolerance towards microtransactions while actively defending them, rather than explaining why they actually need to be there at all, what they bring to the table besides more money in Ubisoft's pocket. True, it isn't NBA 2K19, it isn't nearly as bad as that, but again, pointing to something worse doesn't make it good. And while we're on the topic of Witcher 3, that's a game that did not feature any form of microtransactions, and yet could still afford to maintain both its scope and quality without compromise. So if that game can do it, so can Assassin's Creed Odyssey if Ubisoft really tried. Jason then proceeded to differentiate CD Projekt Red from Ubisoft by stating that the former heavily relies on crunch and that the cost of living in Poland is lower than many cities in which Ubisoft has offices. CD Projekt Red crunch has definitely become widely known over the last year, and Jason isn't wrong about Poland's cost of living being lower. Jason is essentially making the argument that more manpower for less money gives CD Projekt Red a distinct financial advantage, citing that as the reason for CD Projekt Red not having to feature microtransactions in their games while justifying Ubisoft's implementation. While there is a disparity there, it's hardly so wide that Ubisoft would not be able to make ends meet without microtransactions, far from it. So even if Ubisoft has to pay higher wages, with the myriad of healthy monetization operations they've got going, there was no need to recurrently monetize Assassin's Creed Odyssey to keep up with salaries. Not to mention that most of the money made from microtransactions doesn't even go towards giving hardworking employees and developers adequate raises. They go towards either funding additional recurrently monetizable projects or to filling the pockets of top executives. With top executives of major AAA companies making annual salaries worth tens of millions, it seems highly doubtful that they're straining to pay employees or that paying employees is a major consideration when deciding to shoehorn microtransactions in a game like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where these kinds of features do not belong. Another user then raised the point of Jason not being one of the whales that microtransactions target, to which Jason correctly responded that Odyssey isn't the type of game to really exploit whales, as something like a $10 XP booster doesn't come anywhere close to some of the glorified slot machines we have seen in other games. But I would argue that just because a game isn't setting out to exploit you for thousands of dollars doesn't mean it's not exploitative, in my opinion. Even a company scheming to extract an extra $10 out of what a customer would normally pay for can be considered predatory and exploitative, even if not to the extent that loot boxes might be. $10 is not the end of the world, yes, that's true, and not everyone will feel as though they need to spend that extra money in the first place to have a great time with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, but some will be tempted as there is no other way to make the game feel better paced for them. At the end of the day, everyone will have their own take on how they perceive the game's paid XP boosters and other forms of time savers. Some will feel completely apathetic towards them, others will feel their effect on gameplay, and some will stand somewhere in the middle. I'm fine with having a proper discourse on the matter, and I'm certainly down for more nuanced conversations about these kinds of things, to try and see things from multiple perspectives. That's what Jason claims to want as well, but making derogatory insinuations against all YouTubers who are critical of microtransactions isn't really a great way to start, now is it? For someone who wants nuance, he sure took the least nuanced approach in addressing his qualms against Assassin's Creed Odyssey critics. I have no issue with his argument that XP boosters don't deserve as much flack as they're getting, or that the game is still phenomenal despite their inclusion. That is his opinion to have, and it's an opinion that's shared by many others as well, even if I don't necessarily think that Jason made the best case for all his defenses on his stance. But I do have a problem with him completely disregarding and talking down to those on the other side of this argument, especially when he's the one preaching for nuanced conversation. For a while now, I've had the distinct impression that Jason Schreier doesn't particularly like YouTubers, especially channels that are constantly critical of some of the industry's worst trends. And I guess that's also his opinion to have as well, but it's disappointing to see such a narrow-minded approach to discussion. All he's done here is instigate aggravation rather than strive towards mutual understanding. I still respect Jason's work, and I'm not going to stoop to insinuating that he wants to instigate adversity to draw in Twitter followers or some bullshit like that. I think he genuinely believes the criticisms against Odyssey's XP boosters are overblown, which you may or may not agree with. But there's a better way of making that argument than by grossly generalizing all YouTubers. Jason even went as far as screen grabbing a handful of distasteful comments and sarcastically tweeting, "Never mind, YouTube culture is doing great." Look, there is no denying that significant toxic elements do exist on YouTube and in all of the internet, if I'm being frank. But this generalization that all of YouTube is pretty much like this, and using that as the sole excuse to downplay some tangible arguments that you may or may not agree with, is such a single-track, limited, simplistic mindset that's counterintuitive to the nuance that Jason is seeking. Or at least these are one man's thoughts and opinions anyway. I'd love to hear what your take is on Jason's latest tweets and your stance on Assassin's Creed Odyssey's microtransactions in the comments below. With that, I would like to end this news update. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoy my content and would like to support this channel directly, consider donating on Patreon. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Yong Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Yong out!